6 months into the Pacific War, there was an island most people had never heard of. It didn't appear in headlines. It wasn't a political symbol. It wasn't even fully mapped. Guadalcanal was just another humid, jungle-covered speck in the Solomon Islands, remote, quiet, and for a long time strategically ignored. But in the summer of 1942, that changed. American Rozhevka began picking up troubling reports. The Japanese were building something there. Not a base, not a small outpost, an airfield. Hidden under layers of dense jungle, carved out by forced labor, it was taking shape faster than expected, and its location was not random. From Guadalcanal, Japanese aircraft could threaten the vital sea lanes between the United States and Australia. If completed, that airfield would give Japan a powerful forward position, one that could isolate Australia and disrupt Allied operations across the entire South Pacific. Suddenly, that forgotten island became a problem that could not be ignored. The United States had been on the defensive since the attack on Pearl Harbor. Every move until now had been reactive, holding lines, slowing advances, absorbing blows. But this airfield presented a narrow window. If the Americans moved quickly enough, they could seize it before it became operational. If they waited, it would become a fortress in the sky. So a decision was made, fast, risky, and unprecedented. For the first time in the war, the United States would go on the offensive. The plan came together under pressure. There was no luxury of time. Intelligence was incomplete, maps were unreliable, coordination between Army, Navy, and Marine Corps was rushed, supplies were limited, training for amphibious assaults was still evolving, and yet the order was given: Operation Watchtower. The objective was simple on paper: land on Guadalcanal, capture the airfield, and hold it. But nothing about what was coming would be simple. On August 7, 1942, under a gray, uncertain sky, the first wave of U.S. Marines approached the island. The sea was calm, but tension hung heavy over the landing craft. Many of the men had never been in combat. Some still believed resistance would be light. Others sensed something deeper, that this operation, rushed and imperfect, was stepping into the unknown. As the ramps dropped and boots hit the sand, something unexpected happened. There was almost no resistance. The Japanese forces on the island, primarily construction units and lightly armed personnel, were caught completely off guard. Many fled into the jungle, others abandoned their equipment and vanished into the dense green interior. Within hours, the Marines pushed inland and reached the airfield. It was there, carved out of the jungle, exactly as intelligence had described, half-finished, vulnerable, and now in American hands. The Marines didn't celebrate for long, because even as they secured the airfield, something was already going wrong. Offshore, the U.S. Navy, tasked with protecting the transports and supplying the invasion, was facing growing threats. Japanese naval forces were moving into the area faster than expected. Reports of enemy ships and aircraft increased. The risk of a major counterattack was rising by the hour. Then came the decision that would define the opening phase of the battle. The Navy began to pull back. Transports carrying vital supplies, food, ammunition, medical equipment, were forced to leave before fully unloading. Crates were left stacked on beaches, fuel was limited, heavy equipment never made it ashore, and the Marines who had just taken the island suddenly realized they were not fully supported, they were not fully supplied, and they were not alone. Because somewhere beyond the horizon, the Japanese were already preparing their response. Back on the island, the Marines worked quickly. The captured airfield was renamed Henderson Field in honor of a pilot killed earlier in the war. Engineers and Seabees began repairing it, working around the clock to make it operational. Every hour mattered. Whoever controlled the airfield would control the skies above Guadalcanal and the waters around it. But the jungle was closing in.
Heat pressed down relentlessly, rain turned the ground into mud, insects swarmed, malaria and dysentery began to spread. Food was rationed almost immediately, ammunition was counted carefully. Every decision carried weight, because resupply was uncertain. And then there was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes you listen harder, the kind that tells you this is only the beginning. Because the Japanese had not abandoned Guadalcanal, they had only withdrawn, and they were coming back. The Marines knew it, they could feel it. Patrols sent into the jungle began to encounter signs, footprints, discarded gear, distant movement. The enemy was gathering strength, hidden beneath the canopy, waiting for the right moment to strike. What had begun as a bold offensive was already turning into something else, a test of endurance, a fight for survival, and a battle where the outcome was far from certain. Guadalcanal was no longer just an island, it was a line that could not be broken.
At first, the sound was distant, low, rolling thunder across the water. Some Marines thought it was a storm moving in. Others knew better. It was naval gunfire. Just days after the landing, the fragile sense of control the Americans had begun to build was shattered in a single night. Off the coast of Guadalcanal, Allied naval forces collided with a powerful Japanese fleet in what would become one of the worst defeats in U.S. Navy history. The Battle of Savo Island unfolded in darkness, confusion, and devastating speed. Heavy cruisers were caught off guard, illuminated by flares and searchlights, and then torn apart by precise Japanese gunfire and torpedoes. By morning, the ocean was littered with burning wreckage, and the consequences on land were immediate. The U.S. Navy, already concerned about losing more ships, made a critical decision. They withdrew. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, the meaning was clear and terrifying. The ships carrying their food, ammunition, and heavy equipment were gone. The protection they depended on had vanished. They were alone. At first, the full weight of that reality didn't sink in. The airfield had been secured, the perimeter was being organized, patrols were moving into the jungle. There was still a sense that reinforcements would return soon, that this was temporary. But as hours turned into days, and days into a grinding routine of uncertainty, the truth became impossible to ignore. Resupply was not guaranteed. What they had on the island was all they could count on. Crates left half unloaded on the beaches were hastily dragged inland. Marines scavenged for anything usable, food, ammunition, even abandoned Japanese supplies. Rations were cut, water was scarce, medical supplies were limited. Every bullet, every meal, every bandage became something to conserve. And then the bombing began. Japanese aircraft flying from bases further north started daily raids over Henderson Field. The Marines quickly gave these attackers a name, the washing machine Charlie flights at night, and the relentless daytime bombers that came screaming out of the sky with deadly precision. There was no real shelter. Foxholes became lifelines. Men dug into the earth, listening as bombs whistled down, followed by the deafening shock of explosions. Dirt, smoke, and fragments filled the air. Sometimes the bombs hit the airfield, sometimes they hit supply dumps, sometimes they landed right in the middle of Marine positions. Sleep became a luxury. Even when the sky was quiet, the tension never left, because the real fear didn't come from above. It came from the jungle. Beyond the perimeter, hidden in thick vegetation, Japanese forces were arriving, not in massive waves at first, but in small, determined groups. They moved at night, silently, using the terrain to their advantage. The Marines began to hear them, rustling in the darkness, distant whispers, sudden bursts of gunfire. Then came the first serious ground attacks. They were probing at first, testing the lines, looking for weakness, but it didn't take long for those attacks to escalate into full assaults.
One of the earliest came along the Ilu River, later known as Alligator Creek. Japanese forces, underestimating the strength of the marine defenses, launched a direct nighttime attack. They charged across open ground into machine gun fire and artillery. It was brutal. The Marines held their line, cutting down wave after wave. By dawn, the battlefield was silent again, but littered with bodies. It was a clear message. The enemy was not going to retreat. They were going to fight for every inch of the island, and they were willing to die doing it. For the Marines, the psychological toll began to build. This wasn't a fast-moving campaign. There were no clear front lines, no safe rear areas. Every position felt exposed. Every sound at night could mean an attack. Every shadow in the jungle could hide an enemy soldier. Hunger made it worse. With supply lines cut and food running low, rations were reduced again and again. Some men survived on little more than rice and whatever could be scavenged. Weight dropped, strength faded, but the fighting didn't stop. And still, the Navy did not return. The feeling of abandonment settled in, not as anger, but as a cold, hard fact. The Marines understood why the ships had left. They knew the risks, but understanding didn't make it easier. They were holding an island that might not be worth saving. At least, that's how it felt. But Henderson Field changed everything. As engineers worked tirelessly to repair and extend it, the first American aircraft finally began to arrive. Fighters and bombers landed on the rough strip, forming what would soon be known as the Cactus Air Force. Their presence was a turning point, not a solution, but a sign that the Marines were not completely forgotten. Still, it wasn't enough to end the crisis. Japanese naval forces continued to dominate the surrounding waters at night. Reinforcements and supplies were slipping through, landing troops who would soon join the fight against the exhausted Marines. The balance of power was shifting, slowly but steadily, and everyone on the island could feel it. This was no longer just about capturing an airfield. It was about surviving long enough to keep it. The illusion of a quick victory was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous, a battle with no clear end and no way out.
When the sun went down over Guadalcanal, the balance of power shifted. Daylight belonged to the Americans, barely. Henderson Field gave them just enough air cover to challenge Japanese movements. But at night, everything changed. The sky went black. The ocean disappeared into darkness, and the Japanese took control. The Marines had a name for it, the Tokyo Express. It began as a distant rumor, reports of fast-moving ships slipping through the waters under cover of darkness. Then came the confirmation, destroyers, sleek and fast, racing down from the northern Solomon Islands, carrying troops, supplies, and ammunition. They moved in tight formations, running without lights, navigating by instinct and experience. By the time American forces realized what was happening, it was already too late to stop it. Every night, the enemy was getting stronger. From the beaches and defensive lines around Henderson Field, Marines would hear them before they saw anything. The low hum of engines across the water, growing louder, then fading again. Sometimes there would be flashes in the distance. Sometimes the ships would open fire, sending shells screaming into the island before disappearing back into the darkness. It was a war of shadows, and the Japanese were masters of it. Their night-fighting tactics were precise, disciplined, and deadly. Long before radar became reliable, Japanese crews trained to fight in darkness using optics, coordination, and experience. They could strike fast, hit hard, and vanish before a response could be organized. For the Americans, it was frustrating and terrifying because there was almost nothing they could do to stop it. During the day, Henderson Field came alive.
The Cactus Air Force, a mix of Marine, Navy, and Army pilots, launched missions as soon as light broke over the island. Their aircraft were often worn, patched together, and outnumbered, but they flew anyway. They had to. Their mission was simple: find and destroy anything the Tokyo Express had delivered. Fighters roared low over the jungle canopy. Bombers pushed north, searching for ships that had not yet escaped. Every successful strike slowed the Japanese buildup. Every missed target meant more enemy troops slipping into the fight. It was a constant race against time, because once night fell again, the cycle would repeat. More ships, more men, more pressure. On the ground, that pressure was already being felt. Japanese forces, reinforced and increasingly organized, began launching heavier attacks against Marine positions. They moved through the jungle with discipline, using terrain and darkness to close the distance before striking. Mortars opened up from hidden positions, machine guns cut through defensive lines, and then came the infantry assaults, fast, aggressive, and relentless. The Marines adapted quickly. Defensive perimeters were tightened around Henderson Field. Barbed wire was laid where possible. Machine gun positions were reinforced. Artillery was pre-sighted to cover likely approaches. Every night became a test of preparation and nerve, because the attacks almost always came after dark. One of the most intense came along a ridge south of the airfield. Japanese forces, now in greater numbers, launched a coordinated assault, attempting to break through and overrun the American lines. They advanced through thick jungle, climbing uneven ground, pushing forward despite heavy fire. The fighting was close, sometimes too close. Grenades, rifles, bayonets, combat collapsed into chaos in the darkness. Orders were shouted, often unheard. Units became separated. The line bent, nearly broke, but held. By morning, the ridge was still in American hands, but the cost was rising for both sides. The jungle itself became an enemy. Heat never faded, even at night. Rain soaked everything: clothes, weapons, supplies. Mud swallowed boots. Insects bit constantly. Disease spread faster than reinforcements. Malaria, dysentery, exhaustion, they weakened men who were already fighting on the edge of their limits. Food remained scarce. Supplies, when they did arrive, were unpredictable. Some nights, American ships managed to slip in under cover of darkness, unloading what they could before retreating. But it was never enough to match what the Japanese were bringing in. The imbalance was growing, and everyone knew it. The Tokyo Express wasn't just delivering troops, it was delivering time, the time the Japanese needed to build strength, to prepare for a larger, decisive push. Each night they came closer to tipping the balance completely. And yet, the Marines refused to give ground. They couldn't, because Henderson Field was more than just an airstrip now. It was the center of everything, the only reason they still had a fighting chance. Lose it, and the skies would belong entirely to the enemy. The island would become a trap with no escape. So they held. Through bombardment, through hunger, through exhaustion that blurred the line between waking and sleep. They held their positions, knowing that another attack was always coming, that another night would always fall. And out beyond the dark horizon, the engines of the Tokyo Express would start again, bringing with them the next wave of the fight, closer, stronger, and far from finished.
By the time October arrived, Guadalcanal was no longer a desperate gamble. It had become a battlefield that neither side could afford to lose. What had started as scattered clashes, ships passing in the night, brief engagements, sudden bombardments, was now escalating into something much larger. The waters around the island were turning into a graveyard of steel.
Every convoy, every reinforcement attempt, every supply run was now a calculated risk, because control of the sea meant control of the island, and both sides understood that. The first major shock came in darkness, as it often did in these waters. Fleets collided at close range, visibility limited, decisions made in seconds. Shells tore through the night, torpedoes cut silently through the water before erupting into explosions that shattered hulls. Ships burned, listed, and disappeared beneath the surface. For the Americans, the early encounters were costly. Japanese naval forces still held the advantage in night combat. Their coordination was sharper, their tactics refined. They struck first, struck hard, and often withdrew before a full response could be mounted. American ships, still adapting, paid the price in fire and steel. But something was changing. Each battle, each loss forced adjustments. Radar, still new and imperfect, began to play a larger role. Commanders started to trust it, to use it not just as a warning system, but as a weapon. Formations tightened, communication improved. The chaos of earlier engagements slowly gave way to something more controlled. Experience was being written in real time, and it was being paid for in lives. Out at sea, the struggle became relentless. There was no single decisive clash, no one moment where everything was settled. Instead, there were a series of brutal encounters, each one shaping what came next. Convoys carrying reinforcements became targets. American aircraft from Henderson Field struck whenever daylight allowed, forcing Japanese ships to unload quickly or risk destruction. At night, those same ships would return, trying to finish what they started under the cover of darkness. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they didn't make it back at all. The line between victory and defeat often came down to minutes. A delayed sighting, a misread signal, a torpedo launched just seconds too late, or just in time. And all of it fed back into the battle on the island. Because control of every ship that sank took supplies with it, food that never reached hungry soldiers, ammunition that never made it to the front lines, medical equipment that would never treat the wounded. The ocean wasn't just swallowing ships, it was swallowing the ability to keep fighting. For the Japanese, the problem was growing worse. The Tokyo Express had been effective at delivering troops, but it had limits. Destroyers could carry men, but not heavy equipment, not enough food, not the sustained supplies needed for a long campaign. The more soldiers they brought in, the harder it became to support them. Hunger began to spread through their ranks, just as it had among the Marines. On Guadalcanal, the fighting intensified. Japanese forces, reinforced but increasingly strained, launched larger, more desperate offensives. They aimed directly at Henderson Field, knowing that if they could destroy it, they could break the American hold on the island. Artillery pounded the perimeter. Infantry advanced through the jungle in coordinated waves. The attacks were fierce, determined, and often fearless, but they were also costly. American defenses, hardened by months of combat, held firm. Machine guns cut down advancing troops. Artillery responded with precision. Air support, when available, struck assembly areas before attacks could fully develop. The pattern began to shift. Where earlier battles had felt uncertain, even chaotic, there was now a sense, quiet but growing, that the momentum was changing. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily. Out at sea, American naval forces began to stand their ground more effectively. Radar-guided engagements reduced the element of surprise. Coordinated strikes increased the chances of survival and success. Japanese losses, once manageable, were becoming harder to replace. Ships that had once dominated the night were now being challenged and sometimes defeated. Each engagement left scars on both sides, but the balance was no longer as one-sided as it had been. The cost of reaching Guadalcanal for Japan was rising, not just in ships, but in time, in fuel, in men who could not be easily replaced. And still, the battle did not stop. It couldn't, because by now, Guadalcanal was more than just a strategic point on a map. It was a test of endurance, a contest of logistics, a slow, grinding struggle to see which side would break first. Would it be the Marines, holding an island far from home, still short on supplies, still under constant threat? Or would it be the Japanese, trying to sustain an offensive across contested waters, with every delivery becoming more dangerous than the last? The answer was coming, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of every loss, every failed convoy, every attack that fell short. The sea was deciding the outcome, and it was doing so one ship at a time.
By November, Guadalcanal had consumed everything that had been thrown into it. Men, ships, aircraft, gone, one after another, swallowed by jungle, sea, and fire. What remained on the island was no longer a fresh fighting force on either side. It was something worn down, hardened, and stretched to its limit. But the fighting didn't slow. If anything, it became more desperate. For the Japanese, this was the moment that had to decide everything. They had committed too much to turn back. Reinforcements had been sent. Plans had been made for a final, overwhelming push, one that would crush the American defenses, retake Henderson Field, and restore control of the island. Because without Guadalcanal, their defensive line in the Pacific would begin to crack, and they knew it. So they prepared for one last effort. The plan was bold. Warships would move in close under cover of darkness and bombard Henderson Field directly, destroying aircraft, cratering the runway, and leaving the Marines exposed. At the same time, transports would bring in fresh troops, thousands of them, enough to finally tip the balance on land. If it worked, it could end the battle. If it failed, there would be little left to try. What followed was one of the most violent naval clashes of the entire campaign. In the blackness off Guadalcanal, fleets collided again, at close range, under confusion, under pressure, with no room for hesitation. Ships fired at silhouettes. Radar screens flickered with uncertain contacts. Orders were given and lost in the chaos of battle. But this time, the outcome was different. American forces, bloodied but more experienced, fought back with a determination that matched the moment. Gunfire was returned, targets were tracked more effectively. Coordination, once a weakness, held together under pressure. Japanese ships took heavy damage. Some never made it out. The planned bombardment of Henderson Field was disrupted. The transports, left exposed without full protection, became targets. As daylight approached, American aircraft from the airfield, the very target of the attack, took off and struck what remained. Bombs fell, ships burned. Troops meant to reinforce the island never reached it in strength. The offensive had failed. And with it, something deeper began to break. On Guadalcanal itself, Japanese soldiers who had already been fighting for months felt the shift. Supplies were nearly gone. Food had been reduced to almost nothing. Disease spread unchecked. Ammunition ran low. Orders to attack continued, but the strength to carry them out was fading. Hunger became the constant. Not just an inconvenience, but a force that drained energy, blurred judgment, and turned survival into the only priority. The Marines saw it too. Enemy attacks, once aggressive and coordinated, became weaker, less frequent, more desperate. Patrols pushed further into areas that had once been heavily contested and found less resistance. The jungle, which had once concealed a growing threat, now hid something else: collapse. By December, the reality could no longer be ignored. The Japanese command made a decision, not an announcement, not a public admission, but an order: withdrawal.
Under cover of darkness, the same cover they had used for months to bring men in, they now used it to take them out. Quietly, carefully, without giving the Americans a clear target. By early February 1943, it was over. Guadalcanal was no longer contested. It belonged to the United States. For the Marines who had landed months earlier, the victory didn't feel sudden. It didn't feel dramatic. It felt gradual, like a pressure that had been building for so long had finally lifted. But the cost was everywhere. In the empty spaces where men had once stood, in the wreckage scattered across the island, in the ships resting at the bottom of the sea. This had not been a clean victory. It had been earned slowly, painfully, and completely. But its impact reached far beyond the island. Guadalcanal changed the war. For the first time, Japanese expansion had been not just stopped, but reversed. The idea of invincibility, built over months of rapid victories, was gone. In its place was a new reality. They could be beaten. And for the United States, something had shifted as well. This was no longer a defensive war. The momentum had turned. From this point on, the Allies would begin pushing forward, step by step, island by island, across the Pacific. Guadalcanal was where that began. Not with overwhelming force, not with certainty, but with a decision to hold, to endure, and to outlast an enemy that for the first time had been forced to step back. The island that nobody wanted had become the place where everything changed.